Hello there, neighbors, friends, and families. I believe I'm live at the moment. Can I get confirmation from Emily? Am I live? All right. Welcome, everyone, to this afternoon's Healthy Talk with the Neighbors, Friends, and Families campaign. We're going to be talking about the inclusion, exclusion of people with disabilities in conversations about the impacts of sexual violence and how, although people with disabilities are at an exceptionally higher risk for victimization along the spectrum of sexual violence and oppression, but often being excluded from conversations around the subject. So, thank you, neighbors, friends, and families, for hosting this important discussion, and I look forward to spending the next 20 minutes with you folks. My name is Jess Rueger, and I'm a community educator and peer supporter among issues of sexual violence, sexual health, and healthy relationships, healthy sexual awareness, and education. And I come to you today with the distinction of multiple progressive disabilities and lived experience in relationship violence and sexual violence. This is compounded, as we know, all of our intersectional identities interact with each other. We're not just silos in our various lived experiences. So, compounding issues of sexual violence, our lived experience with disabilities can inform us in unique ways about how to address these issues in the community and can help us work together. So my experience with violence and disability together is an interesting and unique journey. However, I know that although I'm not really uniquely positioned to be able to speak about this because I am not alone in this. Domestic violence is something that affects so many people. Sexual violence is everywhere in media, in our communities, and it impacts us all in unique ways. Although we don't all recognize the ways that we are impacted by sexual violence and different behaviors related to unhealthy relationships, we're affected in our communities, in our interactions with people who have lived experience in this. We will interact with these folks in our daily life. They are our neighbors, our friends, our families, our colleagues, our schoolmates. As we interact with folks, we are interacting with the impacts of their lived experience. So, a little bit about my journey. My various disabilities make concentration and memory a little difficult for me. So one of the accommodations that I request is you be patient with me as I allow my notes to guide my progress through this talk. My intellectual disabilities make working memory almost non-existent for me. It is difficult for me to keep on track. Thanks for all the love on Facebook. It is difficult to bring to awareness pattern recognition, confidence to say the things that need to be said, bravery to be a survivor on a journey, and thank you for your patience and attention today. I wish that my academic journey had begun sooner. Like many folks with disabilities, we are often late bloomers when it comes to education, sex, relationships, And I began my academic journey at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children at Western University in 2011. They they supported me in academics, and I supported various projects that they did, including the wonderful project of Neighbors, Friends, and Families, where I learned so much. I made many great connections, and I'm really grateful for those beautiful connections. Krivak inspired me to go to school as a mature student and obtain a university education. It was at post-secondary that I was able to gain a diagnosis for various cognitive disabilities. I was told that, sure, I could continue to pursue a university education, but it would be very difficult for me to complete it without a great extent of academic support and accommodation. So I'm grateful that those resources were there for me. In my post-secondary journey, I underwent rigorous testing for learning disabilities, parsing that out from PTSD associated with trauma. And so really neatly, that's where it was acknowledged that, hey, it's not just disability that has an impact on our trajectory, but that can interact greatly with our lived experience with violence and oppression as well. So it was tricky to complete my degree, but here I am doing community development and working in community education and peer supporting. Some of my mentors in university included Marianne Park, a disabilities advocate. She would like me to continuously share the message with you folks that disabilities is not an exclusive club. It's a club that anyone can join at any time. In this world, we have the temporary privilege, many of us, of being temporarily abled. And it is an illness or an injury or trauma or chance of genetics that can invite us temporarily or permanently into this club of disabilities. And so this is a really relative thing. And I'll talk about how that can be constructed as well. In university, I began working with ANOVA and peer supporting students with lived experience of sexual violence. Many of the students who access peer support were persons with disabilities who were able to start and foster a really healthy conversation around the ways that students with disabilities were really impacted by sexual violence. And so we began to identify and support research and education on the inclusion of folks with disabilities around sex, relationships, healthier relationships when, you know, it's difficult for folks with various disabilities to be involved in education and relationships in the subject in the first place, and we'll go into reasons why. So for a long time, people with disabilities have been excluded from conversations on sexual violence and relationships. It's really tricky for a lot of folks in this world to acknowledge that people with disabilities are sexual beings, that they are engaged in relationships, and that they are sexually active, that they have sexual desires and abilities to navigate healthy consent and healthy relationships. One of the things that people struggle with in relationships with folks with disabilities is acknowledging their ability to consent. So a lot of the world, definitely our media, doesn't recognize folks with disabilities as having the ability to consent, as being sexual agents. And what we would like to argue and advocate for is that many people with disabilities, which are really diverse, have the ability to be sexual, to be intimate, to interact in relationships of a romantic nature. And this is something that is interesting in a world that doesn't recognize our agency. So we're here to advocate for agency and advocate for change and supporting each other in relationships. I want to share a big list of resources, and it is not exhaustive, but some of the most popularly accessed resources for people with disabilities engaging in relationships and other advocates for disabilities and relationships. So they'll be posted along with the video later on, but to just briefly mention some of them. Dr. Doe runs a YouTube channel called Sexplanations and has recently done a video on disabilities and sex, and it addresses a lot of misconceptions about people with disabilities engaging in relationships and dispelling myths around relationships, acknowledging that people with disabilities can be disproportionately impacted by consent violations. Andrew Garza is a Toronto-based activist, disability consultant who is an advocate of including people with disabilities in conversations, acknowledging that they are impacted by relationship violence, sexual violence, but also to acknowledge that they are actively seeking relationships as well. Hannah Witten is based in the UK, another YouTuber on sex and relationships with a stoma disability, medical disability. Jessica Kalgren-Fozard is a big YouTuber advocating for a lot of social etiquette about disabilities and LGBTQ plus inclusion. The Ultimate Guide to Sex and Disability is an amazing resource in book format with 3 authors in North America, and talks about ways to make relationships and intimacy more physically accessible, more intellectually accessible. On Facebook, we have Marianne Park. She is a long-standing disabilities advocate addressing disabilities, and particularly ways that women are affected by their disabilities and are attempting to participate in conversations of inclusion. She runs the Facebook page Network of Women with Disabilities, or NOW. Neighbors, Friends, and Families is an amazing resource for recognizing the warning signs of relationship violence. It calls us to recognize that we all have the ability to recognize warning signs of unhealthy relationships, to be able to intervene and to offer compassionate assistance and change lives. Inova is a London-based resource. They offer in-person counseling with a 24/7 crisis line. They do corporate training around sexual violence. They do wonderful public education, and their mission ultimately envisions a world free from sexual violence. Spot of Delight is a local sex education initiative in downtown London, Ontario. It welcomes families, it welcomes folks of all ages and backgrounds. It's a sex shop downtown with a mission to be discreet, inclusive, and body safe, and it is a survivor positive space. They do public education, they do workshops on supporting healthier relationships of all kinds for folks of all kinds of identities. Opening the Circle is a newer resource in London, Ontario that is offering peer support for those with lived experience. And the peer support is offered by survivors of sexual violence for those with lived experience of sexual violence. And it's very one-on-one, very equal, casual, friendly, and it offers that compassionate understanding that folks with lived experience of sexual violence may want complementary healing modalities that acknowledge, have an understanding that, okay, I get it because I'm a survivor too. Locally, we have the Women's Event Committee organizing events around ending gender-based violence. They use accessible spaces and include as many different formats of accessibility as possible for a completely volunteer-run organization. Online, we have o.school. That is a web address, and they are free and inclusive relationship coaching, sex education, online training, tons of free resources. Brook.org in the UK has a great campaign they're promoting right now by Emily Yates. And Emily manages a charity called Undressing Disability. And it aims to normalize sex and disability and promote sexual education and awareness for people with disabilities. So acknowledging that folks are seeking relationships. And offers resources. So the reason that we need to have this conversation today is because connection is a critical need for humans. It doesn't have to be, super intimate relationships or sex and sexuality, but human connection is something that we are programmed for. And we need to talk about how sexual violence complicates that, sexual violence and disabilities have these compounding barriers that work together to create even greater obstacles towards inclusion in this world. So if you believe that ability is temporary and ability is relative, then it leads us to acknowledge that one of the biggest obstacles that we are going to face in this world as survivors and as people with disabilities is that a lot of these obstacles are constructed because we are humans who create the world that we live in. And in creating this together, we create spaces for normal or typical sort of identities and access points. We create buildings with stairs and not ramps. We create videos online that are done verbally without the ability to have ASL, American Sign Language interpretation present, or BSL, British Sign Language, or Queer Sign Language for even more accessibility. It is all of these things that we create in connection that when done without thought for survivors, when done without thought for folks with disabilities, that we end up creating exclusive spaces and exclusive conversation. So where do we get some of these ideas that help us form these sort of barriers? Well, where do we see people with disabilities in the media? Where do we see people with disabilities included in conversations when we're talking about healthy relationships, healthy sexuality, and addressing issues such as sexual violence and oppression? I mean, in an advertising world where sex sells and wheelchairs are not sexy and interpreters are not sexy, we're certainly not seeing people with disability having a strong presence in beauty and fashion campaigns. And so we're really bound by the constraints that we've been exposed to our whole lives. And we're bound by constraints of continuous messaging. And it's not just a single message that has an impact, right? But it's the repeated long-term exposure over and over of not seeing folks with disabilities included in the conversations. I believe that as neighbors, friends, and families, we can support each other by being kind to one another, by making an effort to get educated and have a greater understanding of the impacts of sexual violence on our world and on the impacts of disability on differing access to resources and communities that we have. I think that we have to bring an intersectional lens when confronting issues of sexual violence and healthier relationships. If we don't think about the different ways that people are impacted by these real world issues, it's difficult to have a holistic lens and be able to see how we can really problematize and solve these issues that we're facing. I think it's important to acknowledge as well that we're not alone. For folks who have been impacted by sexual violence, for folks with disabilities, it's very stigmatizing. The impacts can be very isolating. However, over 1 million Ontarians identify as having a disability, just for sort of this like regional visibility. I'd like to point to the resources that have been listed today, to the Neighbors, Friends, and Families campaign for more information on ways that folks can intervene, and for ways that young folks can get involved in the conversation as well through the series of healthy talks that have been posted on the Neighbors, Friends, and Families Facebook page. I want to thank everyone for their time today in coming together to bring awareness to the issue of sexual violence and disabilities linked together, and for being a part of this conversation. Thank you so much for accessing all of these resources. Thanks for NFF for hosting. Have a lovely Wednesday.